Hi, this is George LeMieux, Chairman of the Board of the Gunster Law Firm. With Gunster's View from the Top, I'm privileged to be joined today with Dr. Ron Faucheux. Dr. Faucheux is a nationally respected pollster, nonpartisan political analyst, and he has a unique background in politics and government. We are fellow Hoyas. He graduated from Georgetown with a foreign service degree, and then he went on to the University of New Orleans, where he got his PhD in political science and a law degree from LSU. And we both also have in common that we have an X at the end of our name. So there's some, must be some French-Canadian connections or Acadian connections there. Dr. Faucheux also is a former member of the Louisiana House of Representatives, being the youngest person elected to that post. He served as the editor of Campaigns and Elections, and he's now publisher of a daily newsletter that provides polling information, which to me is really the best guide that you can have as you go through the elections, and enjoy reading it every day, especially up into this last election. The name of the newsletter is Lunchtime Politics. So it's my privilege to introduce and bring to a view from the top, Dr. Ron Faucheux.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Happy to be with you.
Thank you so much. Well, polling is a big issue. It's been discussed, especially in light of this last election. There were a lot of predictions of large advantages for the vice president, large advantages for Democrats, predictions of a blue wave, and those predictions didn't bear out. So give us your take on what happened with polling in the last election.
Well, one thing I think we have to start off with is that there's a difference between a poll of a random representative sample of voters and people who are making predictions. Some pollsters do polls and then they make predictions. Polls actually were never intended to be used for prediction purposes. They're really snapshots in time. They're not crystal balls. So they really only tell you where things were at the time the poll was taken. And in some elections where there's late breaking movement, the polls don't even catch any of that. So we have to keep that in mind. But generally speaking, when you look at the whole 2020 election cycle, including primaries, the general election, the polls did a lot better than what the perceptions are. The problem is that in the general election, there were a lot of polls that showed Joe Biden running way ahead in states all over the country, particularly places like Wisconsin. Florida was an example, and showing Biden ahead, and then he ultimately lost those states, or he carried the states by very narrow margins. Also, of the 21 national polls that were taken, they all were correct in showing Biden ahead, but the big majority of them were showing him way too far ahead, and that's really what caused the problems. And if polls are just showing who's winning, that's fine. But if they're not giving you a sense of how big the margin is, then that becomes a big problem. And that's what we saw in this last election.
And Dr. Faucheux, for those that polls that were way off, some that were showing, the vice president winning 10 points in Pennsylvania and 10 points and more in Wisconsin. There was that Washington Post poll that came out right before the election. It was way off on one of those two states. Are they using a bad model? I mean, a lot of people don't understand that polling is modeling too. It's not just calling up 600 people and finding out how they're going to vote. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think might have gone wrong on the polls that were way off?
Yeah, well, there's a number of things that can go wrong. The first thing is the normal standard of error. Most of these polls have a scientific standard of error of plus or minus 3 points, which is in effect the science saying, you can do these polls, but don't expect them to be right down to the penny. They're going to be there's going to be some difference. There's going to be some error there in reaching out to a sample. And so that explains some of it. But it only explains how all polls can be inexact to some extent. But what it doesn't explain is in this last election, and we saw some of it in the 2016 election too, it was really the Republican vote that was underpolled as opposed to the Democratic vote. So a normal standard of error would apply to all polls, and it wouldn't just apply to one partisan side. So the standard of error doesn't explain a lot of the differences we saw. Some of the differences that we saw between the polls and what ultimately happened can be attributed to just bad polling techniques. They might have done a bad job picking the sample. They might have had biased samples. They might have had biased questionnaires. You mentioned the issue of modeling. You know, what does the electorate look like in the poll relative to what it's going to look like on election day? And the dirty little secret is that that's really a guess that the pollsters make. And sometimes they're way off. And sometimes they're off because they have partisan blinders on, and they make their polls conform to their wishful thinking when it's not always the case.
Right.
And the final thing in the last two elections is I believe there was a hidden Trump vote. I believe there were voters who were not saying to pollsters they were for Donald Trump when in fact they were, or ultimately they were. I think we saw that twice in 2016 and 2020. I think we saw it in a lot of the critical states. And I think we saw it nationally. It's hard to explain how big that is, because when you're talking about a hidden vote, by its definition, it's hard to find. And I think a lot of pollsters didn't attempt to measure it, and they didn't attempt to talk about it because they didn't believe it existed, when in fact it did exist. And I'm from Louisiana, and we've had a couple of politicians in our state's history. Jim Garrison was a former district attorney in New Orleans. Some of you may remember he was the district attorney who claimed he solved the John F. Kennedy assassination case and indicted people and tried them for conspiring to kill President Kennedy. Well, anyway, he was a very controversial figure, but he kept winning elections. And the polls showed that he would lose a lot of these elections, but always do better on election day. So there was a hidden Garrison vote. When David Duke, the former Ku Klux Klan leader, was running for governor and senator in Louisiana, the polls always underpolled it because a lot of people didn't want to say they were for David Duke when they intended to vote for him. So we have seen in practical terms this happen before. We've also seen it in what's called the Bradley effect. When Tom Bradley, an African-American mayor of Los Angeles, ran for governor of California, the polls showed he was winning. But then on election day, he lost. And what was happening there was sort of a reverse hidden vote, where people were saying they're for somebody when in fact they didn't intend to be for them. So Donald Trump has had his own set of circumstances around him as it affects polling. And it makes it very, very difficult to poll Donald Trump. I think it's the reason why during the election, even though the polls were showing Biden pretty consistently for a long time with 7 to 8 to 9 point national leads, a lot of people were not that confident over it, including Biden's own supporters. And you know, the final polling average nationally showed Biden ahead by 8.2 points. And he's now, it looks like he's won the national popular vote by about 4 points. So it was showing he had a margin of twice the size of what he actually had. And it also showed, as we said, increased margins in states like Ohio and Iowa, of course, in Florida and Wisconsin and Michigan as well. Although I have to say that in the last day before the election, the polls were showing a lot of those states tightening up. So they were able to catch some of it, but they weren't able to catch most of it. And as a result of that, I think, you know, the polling industry has taken a big hit. I think some pollsters deserve that hit, frankly. But
do you think, Dr. Faucheux, that some of these pollsters will, you know, adjust their polling methods to try to, I mean, presumably, although I shouldn't presume that Donald Trump will not be on the ballot in 4 years, because there's talk of that, but assuming he's not, do you think that there will be an adjustment that's made by some of these pollsters that the Republican vote or a vote in any particular election may be a little underrepresented in the polling?
It's possible. Ultimately, though, I don't think a lot of the pollsters will believe that, and they're not going to adjust for something that they have no empirical reason to adjust for, which is what happened this time. You know, we saw similar things happen 4 years ago. And one of the things that the polling industry found was that it was overpolling voters with who were college graduates and underpolling voters who were not. And I think a lot of pollsters made sure they increased their sample targets to pick up more people who weren't college graduates. But when pollsters start in the course of modeling a sample by throwing in guesswork, oh, we're going to add 4 points here, or 3 points here, or whatever, then it's going from polling to something else. I don't know what that something else is called. I guess it's just guesses. But it's very hard for pollsters to get into that. But I think it is a problem. I think it's a real problem. And we also saw it in some of the down ballot races. Some of the Senate races, the polls showed exaggerated margins for the Democrats.
Sure.
And Democrats might have won the seats. They didn't win them by the margins the polls were showing. And in Maine, for example, which is kind of the poster election of
The Susan Collins race.
Exactly. It showed Susan Collins losing by about 4 points consistently for the last 3 or 4 months of the election. And then on election day, she won the race by 8 or 9 points.
Right.
And so that was just off, you know. And but the thing that I know a lot of Republicans are concerned about, and for good reason, is that most of these polling errors that we're talking about, not all of them, there are a few that went the other way, but most of the polling errors, particularly when we average the polls, show that it was Republicans that were underpolled, not Democrats. In fact, the polling average nationally for Joe Biden showed him at 51.5% of the vote, and he's now at 51%. So the polls got his vote on the nose, but they were about 4 points short of Donald Trump's vote. And if you would add a 3 or 4 point hidden vote to Donald Trump's numbers, you know, then they all would have been pretty much online.
Right. Last question for you, Dr. Faucheux, into the political piece. The president has accused some of these pollsters as not really trying to predict an accurate outcome, but to be advocacy. And I know from when I was running the governor's campaign here in Florida, there were particular polls like, and I never say this correctly, Quinnipiac, who always seemed like they were 5 points to the Democratic side. You know, we had our own polling. There were other polling outfits, and they were just always seeming to weight towards the Democrats. So what's your thinking on that? Are there some of these pollsters who are kind of particularly on one side of the political fence or the other, and are they doing something more than polling?
Let me tell you what I think they're doing. I can't say what they're doing because I'm not in there with them doing it. But and even though, by the way, I do have a polling firm and I do polling. We did none of the public polls in any of the presidential, Senate, or governor's races. So we're not talking about any of the polls that I did, and I have no business interest either way in how this comes out. So I'm not trying to indict the polling industry, but I'm not trying to vindicate it either. I just think we want to learn from it. But I believe that some of the polls, and there are some Republican polls that do the same thing. The pollsters have a partisan mindset, and they honestly believe that their mindset is correct. And what that mindset is a bias. And, you know, there was a polling firm, for example, that claimed they got the last election right, 2016, because they were showing Trump ahead when other polling firms didn't do it. But this time, for example, they showed Trump ahead in 5 key states that Biden carried. So if you are biasing, and I'm not accusing them of doing it in a corrupt or intentional or advocacy way, but if they are biasing because of their frame of mind, a polling sample, then you know, over time you can see that. And I think we do see that in a lot of cases. So I would hope that those firms that have been doing that, and in our newsletter, we generally point out, like for instance, the Quinnipiac poll, that they generally show Democrats doing better in their polls than other polls do. That maybe they can figure out what they are in fact doing and try to move everything to what could be a more accurate number.
Well, Dr. Faucheux, thank you. Thank you for helping us better understand the polling process. We really appreciate your lunchtime politics email, and I encourage everybody who's watching A View from the Top to find that and subscribe to it, because it's really helpful. And we're just really appreciative of you helping us all understand better how polling works. And thank you for being on Gunster's View from the Top.
Well, thank you. Very much appreciated.
And to all our viewers, have a great and happy and safe Thanksgiving. Take care. Okay. Ron, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Very good. How do you think things are going in the next 2 years in Florida with the Senate race? And
I think, Donald Trump, in Florida, you win a race by 400,000 votes. That's a shellacking. We don't have races that are that close statewide. Last time for governor and Senate, DeSantis won by 30,000. Rick Scott won by 9,000. We're talking about, I think it was 8 million votes cast. So to win by 400,000 is a lot. I think that's really encouraging for Republicans. You saw this big country of origin among Hispanics who are from Colombia, Venezuela, other places where there's dictatorship, socialism, really come to the Republican side. So I think that's favorable. The Democrats don't have any bench here. They'd have to get, if one statewide elected official, who's the Commissioner of Agriculture, we'd have to get her to run for governor, or get a congressperson to run for governor. I think it's helpful that Biden won. If you were in the middle of a Trump second term, I think that would be hard for Rubio and DeSantis. So I think they're pretty well set. I think they're gonna win. You never know, right? A lot can happen in 2 years, but.
Yeah. Yep, very good. What effect do you think Bloomberg's money had on the election?
I don't think much.
Like it was, I mean, it really. It
was 10 million.
Talking about,
it was not insignificant. But
I mean,
he was
probably that $100 million.
$100 million, rather. He was trying to sign felons, to vote by paying off their restitution, and that was too little, too late. I think they got like 4,000 people restored.
Yeah.
I think over time, if you did that, if you spent that money over the next 2 years, the big thing too is the Republican Party in Florida. They went and they registered. They found what they determined to be were likely Republican voters that were not registered. And over the past year, they've been keeping those people out and registering them. And allegedly, they converted, for the ones they registered, they converted about 40% of them to voters. So that was a big effort. And the Democrats did nothing.
It's incredible.
Yeah. So we'll see. We're used to being a state with close elections and then an election screw up, and we had neither.
Right, and a 3.6% margin looks like a landslide now.
It does. It does.
Well, it was impressive. It was one of the few states that Trump increased his margin,
Right.
And given all the attention, it was amazing. But we'll see.
How are things in Louisiana?
Things in Louisiana are fine. It's been pretty quiet. Our two senators are generally pretty popular, and they don't. It's not likely. Cassidy just won an easy re-election, and Kennedy will win again next time, and there'll be congressional reapportionment, but there's only one Democrat in the House, that's Cedric Richmond's seat, and the Democrats will hold that in the special election. So nothing.
You have a Democratic governor, is that right?
Yeah, John Bel Edwards is governor. He's term limited, so he has 3 more years on his term, and it's highly likely a Republican will take the seat after that.
I served with David Bitter and Mary Landry when I was there. Are they
Right,
still
well,
around Louisiana?
yeah, they really are. Well, when I was in the state legislature, Mary she literally sat in the seat right behind me, and David came in right after I left into the state house. And so I've known him for years. And Mary, Mary's active, and David's still active, you know, and not so much publicly, you don't see them on TV much, but they all have you know, there's very little democratic infrastructure in Louisiana outside of the African American vote, and it's all funded by trial lawyers, and labor provides some help, but labor is disintegrated outside of public employees. So she's really the last uh, federal statewide candidate who won. So she still continues to have a lot of connections and can help in campaigns. And Bitter had made a pretty good effort at sort of attempting to handpick people and run them for office. Wasn't always successful, but I think now
Mary
that.
was very formidable in the Senate. She was a
What's that?
Mary was very formidable in the Senate. She was a very effective legislator. She would, you probably know this, but these senators all want to go home Thursday night. And, it'd be Thursday at 3 o'clock, and Mary would be on the floor with an amendment to a bill, and it would be something maybe even leadership didn't want, but she would get it passed because people wanted to go home. So she knew how to use her leverage.
Yeah. Yeah, she's got good political instincts.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Well, so nice to
good.
meet you, Ron. I appreciate it. Thank you for doing this.
Great, thank you.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.